And we are live. And today we have the amazing Holly Christie, who is a very avid reader and genuinely lovely person, as the guest on Book Chat Live. So, before we start, talk a little bit about how much you love books and a little bit about what you do, but not too much. We don't want to get too promotionally.
I love books. I've been an avid reader pretty much forever. Since I remember the first time really independently reading, I was about 6 or 7 and just loving the story and it going from there. And I love rereading stuff as well, like the storytelling, even when you can see where a story is going, like it's how it's executed. And I love that you get to create this whole world in your head. I'm going to be honest, like video content often bores me. So, I am much more in the evenings going to be sitting there with my Kindle, reading a book and just going off into this world that someone else has built that I get to visualize. So it's a big thing for me. People won't be surprised to hear that I am a creative. I'm a website designer, so I'm very much about kind of building words, worlds on pages as well. I started my career as a blogger. Again, it's that storytelling, that
writing,
like that writing, that side of it as well. So when you asked me to be on Book Chat, I was like, this is so cool. It's so exciting.
Well, before you get too bored with the video side of things, shall we talk about the first book, which is Rachel's Holiday by Marian Keyes. So, why did you pick this book?
So I first came across Rachel's Holiday when I was in my, I think, late teens, early 20s, when Marian Keyes was just becoming a big name. And it's a story of recovery. Like Rachel is an addict, and it's loosely based on Marian's own experience of being an alcoholic and going through rehab. And Marian always talked about writing emotional landscapes and how much kind of changes within that. And the story of Rachel feels so important because it talks about, the feelings of like her life spinning out of control and the feelings of hopelessness and the overwhelm and where she falls down and gets back up. And I felt like it's so representative of real life and people's inner worlds, not just addicts, because you see the dynamics of all the family around them and how the addiction affects there as well. And it influenced me so much that actually in my 20s I went on to train to be a counsellor, and I wanted to specialise in addiction and eating disorders. Obviously life took me in a different direction, but I think it was just such a raw and honest account, and it was so, I think that Marian was so generous in her storytelling and sharing of experience there, that it's always, I don't keep very many paperback books. I like to have everything on my Kindle that I can take everywhere with me. I always have a copy of Rachel's Holiday, and I usually always have a relatively new one because I've given my copy away to someone to say, you've got to read this. It's really, kind of pertinent.
So it was kind of like a life-changing book for you then, in a way, is that?
Yeah, and I think picking it up in my late teens as well, when you have all of those feelings of being misunderstood and you're just trying to navigate the world yourself. And actually here are adults who aren't navigating the world very well, or, who are finding different ways and stuff like that. So yeah, it was a really big deal.
Okay, let's go into the next book, which is kind of similar. Again, Rachel by Marian Keyes.
It's the follow-up. And it was written like 25 years later as well. And I've actually seen Marian talking live about it, and she said it was the hardest book for her to write, to kind of go back to that space, having been sober for 30 odd years. And it talks about where Rachel's life has gone after that. And I don't want to give everything away with the book, but the title kind of gives it away a bit, that Rachel within the book, within the storytelling, it turns out that she has kind of relapsed into this addiction without knowing it. And it's all the markers around it were different, and how the landscape of her life worked out because of that. As I say, I don't want to give too much away, but it talks about loss. It talks about some, as a parent, it talks about some quite kind of pertinent loss. And again, I don't want to have to put trigger warnings and stuff on this. And again, the storytelling was very beautiful and very generous and very sensitive as well. And I just think it really deserved a place on my favourites list.
Okay. Shall we go on to a non-Marian Keyes book? Let's go on to the thing.
I could have just done 12 books of Marian.
Oh, well, yeah, actually, I mean, to be honest, she's a good author. So, The Names by Florence Knapp.
This was incredible. So I kept seeing it come up with all the bloggers saying, oh, I'm reading this book. And I have audiobooks on Spotify. And I thought, oh, I'll give that a go. And I cannot believe it's like the first novel of someone that it's just that polished. And so the book is basically about a woman who has a baby, and there are 3 different names that this baby could have. Like, her husband wants the baby called one thing, she wants to call the baby something else, her daughter, the baby's sister, wants to call it something else. And it goes on to like the sliding doors kind of side of it, to show what kind of a life that family would have had that baby been named. One of the names was Bear, one of the names was after the father, and these 3 different lives and these 3 different outcomes. And it touches on some really meaty subjects as well. It touches on things like domestic abuse and coercive control there as well, which again I think is really important in storytelling. So I am very open about my history of having a marriage that had domestic abuse within it and coercive control, and for a long time I didn't even kind of really realize that that's what it was, because no one ever talked about it. So the fact that this is being woven into people's stories and it's being put out there in the mainstream is just it feels like a real gift. But as I say, the storytelling of these 3 different lives, all around names. And I have 3 children who I was obsessive about what their names would be. I wanted to really love their names. And so this just absolutely spoke to me, and it was beautifully written.
Yeah. This is where you're going to say, my 3 children, 1, 2, and 3. And it's like...
Actually, my 3 children are all named from books, actually.
Oh, okay.
Apart from Dylan. Dylan was named after Luke Perry's character in Beverly Hills 90210.
Yeah.
I saw that when I was 12, and he was just so cool. And I was like, I'm going to have a Dylan. Jago is called Jago after a character in a book called The Love Letter by Fiona Walker. Yeah. And Amelin is called Amelin after Amelin Hodor, which is one of the Star Wars book that's written by Claudia Gray.
Okay.
So they all come from books.
Yes. So keeping up the literary tradition. So
absolutely.
Okay, shall we go into the next book, which is Untamed, Stop Pleasing, Start Living by Glennon Doyle. I think this has been on the book show before.
So I first discovered Glennon Doyle through her blog in, I think, 2014, 2015, when she'd just written Love Warrior. And I loved her style of writing. I loved the way that she viewed the world. And during the time that I saw that, she was kind of exiting her marriage, and she met Abby Wambach, and Untamed is really her story of hers and Abby's love story, but told in a lifestyle and how she understands people and how she understands the world to be. And all her stuff's written quite bloggy, so you don't have like really meaty chapters. She's so good at saying what needs to be said. And it was the first book, I think, that I read, which was, I mean, it's been out for about 5 years now, something like that. It was before lockdown that I read it. And it was the first book that really kind of spoke to me and said, as women being marginalized, kind of within society, this isn't enough anymore. We're not settling for this. And we actually get to lead our own lives. And like Glennon Doyle says within Untamed, she says, you have one wild and precious life, and it's yours. And when it's gone, it's gone. And I always think that this book really kind of gives you permission to embrace all parts of yourself. Yeah.
So non-fiction, presumably.
Non-fiction.
Yes.
No.
Yeah. And what would you?
Occasional non-fiction book.
Yes. not what would you say is the number one thing that you took away from this book that you thought, oh yeah, I'm going to apply that, or you learned something from it?
that people pleasing isn't actually serving anyone around me, and I can be quite a codependent people pleaser. And she talks about this time that she was with her daughter and she was putting this necklace around her daughter's neck, and she thought, I am staying in this marriage for you, but would I want this marriage for you if you were going through this? And she was like, no. So why am I giving examples of bad love to my children, just because society thinks I should be doing this? And so to say that actually by people pleasing, you are unconsciously trying to control the narrative. And actually, you need to disappoint everyone around you to save disappointing yourself, and to walk freely and with a lot of integrity.
Yeah, I think people pleasing is a problem a lot of us suffer with, in that it's easier not to fight with people over things, but then you end up, you never express any of your opinions because you're worried about what other people think. So.
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway, let's go on to the next book, which is All the Way to the River by Elizabeth Gilbert. So
I love Elizabeth Gilbert. Obviously read Eat, Pray, Love, where everyone's read that, seen the movie. I saw, and it was actually through Liz Gilbert that I found Glennon Doyle. I saw Liz Gilbert speak in London when she was releasing Big Magic back in 2015, I think it was. And just hearing her speak, and she was being interviewed for the book, it was just such a game changer. She kind of seems to stand in such a kind of power and conviction, and she's a lifelong people pleaser, and it's just some of the statements that she made about, again, your life is yours to live. And so I followed her ever since then. And her partner Raya died again before COVID, and All the Way to the River is the story of Raya dying, Elizabeth finding out that she was a love and sex addict as well, and how that was kind of affecting her life. And so it's kind of a journey of her healing, but it's so generously shared and written, and it's like life is so messy and life is so complicated, and it's just so beautifully told within this book and generously shared.
Okay.
And I listened to the audiobook of Elizabeth reading it herself, and it's just that kind of that patter, that cadence that you're just like, oh, it feels like being given a hug.
Yeah, well, I've got a whole load of audiobook credits I need to listen to, so maybe I'll add this or some of the other books to it to actually get round to. I listened to this one book about the history of the Roman Empire, but it was about like 5 billion hours long, so it's putting me back into the credits. So I've got a whole load to listen to. Anyway, on to the next book, which is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo.
So this book was, it was like the book of the summer a couple of years ago. And again, I listened to it on audiobook, and it wasn't massively the sort of thing I would usually be listening to or reading. But I was compelled by how many other people were reading it and recommending it. And I found the storytelling of it really fascinating. And it was about a young woman who grew up dirt poor in Mexico, in poverty, abusive father, and she went to Hollywood and made it as an actress, a really well-known actress in Hollywood. And she did that through a lot, and this was in like the 40s or 50s, that sort of time. And so she did it a lot. There was a lot of racial prejudice, so it was going platinum blonde and doing this and that. And she had all of these different husbands, and it tells the story. So the book's set that she is coming to the end of her life, and she is giving an interview to someone who's going to write her memoir. And so she talks around all the different circumstances around the different husbands. The first one was abusive and she left, and then the next one was this, and then she ended up remarrying the second husband when it was the seventh. And there's all kind of complication. And there's a really good twist, which actually comes right to the last line of it. Everyone asked about my husband, no one asked about this. I'm not going to give it away, but it's very cleverly told. And I think you say about the history of Roman Empire, I love historical stuff. I love going back and understanding more, especially I was raised by my grandmother. And so when we hit on those time periods, a bit like the BBC's Call the Midwife, and I'm like, oh, that's when my nana was having her family. And that it's just really interesting to kind of understand that world from a storytelling point of view rather than a like historical facts point of view.
Yeah, I think like history and story. Well, I mean, you could argue like his story. It's his story, in like or her. I suppose we could have her story, but we won't get too woke in this show.
Yeah, I'm going to be woke. I'm going with her story.
Go with her story, but yeah, they are intertwined, aren't they? Like the scene and the actual book are very intertwined. Anyway, let's go to the next one, which is Never Greener by Ruth Jones.
Yes. Oh, wow. That one. Again, I listened to that one and I always kind of feel like I was very lucky to listen to it with the person who narrated it, because there are all these different accents in the book and the narrator just did all this Scottish, Welsh, this, that and the other. And it's brilliant storytelling. And obviously Ruth Jones writes a lot of screenplays and she's a screenwriter, and, you know, she comes from the Gavin and Stacey and all that sort of thing. And I really, really just enjoyed listening to this. And it was about how different people's lives were interwoven. There's a good twist in it as well. And it's about how some people kind of like accidentally meet up again in like midlife. And it tells the story from their earlier life, plus going into where they are at the moment. And then the book moves on towards the ending, which is really satisfying, which is like in a few years' time, this is what's happened as well. It's just absolutely brilliant storytelling. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah. So do you feel like the fact that she came from a screenplay background made the book have a different kind of style to the normal?
Yes, she also said with that, because I think there was an interview with the author at the end of it or something like that, she also said it's the first book she actually wrote as a screenplay. So she wrote it with the idea that this would be adapted to screen. And while there's no kind of stage directions on there or whatever, you could really see how this is written scene by scene. And there was something very engaging about that. Like you could really picture it without it feeling like a bit muddy in areas. Things where, like J.K. Rowling always says about her books were always about detail. You never wonder what someone eats or what the type of spoon's like because she's described it. Ruth Jones really had this way of putting you in the room with the characters. You really knew where you were at with it. Okay,
right. The next one is Content Fortress by Martin Huntbach, and I don't know what happened to Lindsay Huntbach. This is my automatic feed, so it's clearly sexist in some way. It took it from Amazon.
As a feminist, I always put Lindsay's name first. I sometimes exclude Martin's name. Martin is a very lovely person, by the way, as is Lindsay. But yes, I always think of it. I think because the book's written a little bit from Lindsay's point of view. She talks in first person and refers to Martin. So I always think of it as Lindsay's book. Obviously non-fiction.
Yeah.
This is a marketing book. It is a guide to how to answer your clients' questions on your websites. As we said to everyone, I'm a website designer. And it takes the concepts of Marcus Sheridan's They Ask, You Answer, and it really develops those concepts even more. And it's great. If ever I'm feeling a bit stuck about, what should I blog about or what should I do? I grab my copy of this and I will just flip to any part of it and like, I'll write some repelling content today. And that's always really fun to write because it's like reasons you don't want to work with me. I'm not interested in this or that. It also says to you, write really helpful content, and then you can send that through to your clients when they book calls. You can say, here's some information before we go on the call. It's definitely changed the way that I run my business and the way I show up with marketing and stuff. And it's really easy read. It's, it's written for people who are already like struggling under the mental load of running a business. So it's a great book.
Yeah, so I presume it's about content marketing and the stuff that you produce on social media and the like. That's kind of what it means. Yeah. And
blog posts for websites and stuff like that.
Okay,
Yeah. So it's mainly aimed at kind of websites. Martin and Lindsay were website designers before they moved into content marketing and stuff. So it's very much about how to get the most out of what you've already got.
Anyway, right, and to the next one, which is You Do You by Sarah Knight.
I love this book. my podcast producer gave me this book last year. I would always be saying to my podcast producer, Neil, about, I don't feel confident saying this, or I don't feel doing that. And he would always come back and he would say to me, and again, Holly, I'm not your therapist, but, And so when I met him for lunch last year, he said, I've got you this book, and it was new to you. And I said to him, I know that, because on the front it says, also the author of the life-changing magic of not giving a FCUK. And I said to him, I've got the first book. My sister-in-law gave it to me. She's a therapist. I loved this. Is written, I think the woman who's written it, Sarah Knight, she is a journalist, and it's written in that very engaging first person, one-to-one way. She really reminds me in her writing of Laura Belgray. And if you're signed up to Laura Belgray's emails, you have the, here's the truth of it. And it's about, again, having permission to just be you and not look at your negative things. In fact, Sarah Knight talks about reframing the negative stuff into positives, and also saying, I deserve this in my life, so I'm going to do this way or do it that way. It's just really refreshing. It's fun, it's engaging, and it's about living the life that you want to live, not what other people expect of you.
Did you find it useful as a therapy book then?
I'll let my therapist answer that question. I don't know whether I found it useful as therapy, but I do sometimes, because I was using like a journal at the time, I do sometimes go and see like the work I did from the book with the reframes and stuff like that. I think there was something very inspiring about there are people out there who are just living their lives and being completely unapologetically them.
Yeah. And
there was something, that's the message I really took away. And I think it is a book that I hope Neil's not expecting it back, because it's something I plan to just kind of pick up. And again, you can just do it chapter by chapter. Yeah. It's, not necessarily a very kind of sequential thing. So yeah, it's definitely one that's earned its space on the bookshelf.
Okay, right. Let's go on to the next one. Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams.
Yes, so I read this a few years ago now, and I think I might have read it during lockdown. And again, it was a real trending book at the time. Yeah. Everyone was saying about, everyone read this, it's this and that. And it's about a young adult who is Black. I think she's from Nigerian heritage in London, who suddenly her relationship ends and she ends up back at her grandparents' house, and just a bit, she's going from flat share to this and that. And it was a real example of how tough her life is for the younger generation. I mean, life's tough for all generations. We've all got stuff that we're navigating.
Yeah.
And I think this generation can particularly struggle with that as well. And then the biases and prejudice that she also has, like she is feeling absolutely terrible, and her grandmother makes her go in the shower every single day, and she says, no grandchild of mine will leave this house without washing their skin every morning. Like that, having to be absolutely perfect all the time because the weight's already stacked against you. And during the book, Queenie, the main character, she has some relationships with some men. And again, it brings into the concept of domestic violence, domestic abuse, and domestic abuse in ways that you don't necessarily recognize at the time are abusive. And it's kind of tied into the racism side of it as well. And again, I thought it was generous storytelling. It was gifted storytelling. I think Candice Carty-Williams, wasn't that old when she wrote it as well. It was really insightful. I'm a Londoner, it's set in London. It was really insightful into the community and challenges and everything that people have, and it was really well written.
Okay. And we can go on to the last book, which I don't know if you're trying to tell us something about your personality here, but Bimbo by Ashley James.
So this is new out. It's a book all about feminism. And Ashley, lots of people know Ashley James. She's on This Morning a lot of the time, kind of really debating points and breaking down the kind of rubbish that some of the people come out with. And, she is a fierce feminist. She's fiercely, supporting about equality. And again, she's talking about all of these themes in the book. The book only came out a couple of months ago. She talks about all of the themes, and she also talks about her own story and her own experiences within them. And, there's some really gritty experiences in there. And she talks about how, girls get sexualized when they're very young, at 10 or 11. And it's just a really fascinating book. I think it's incredible that she wrote it. She shared some really personal stuff within it, and not for altruism, but especially because she's quite a big and well-known name as well. And again, I listened to that as an audiobook, and I was like, this is the gift I didn't know I needed, hearing in her own words this book that she wrote. And it's a real game changer for kind of viewing what goes on in society, how it goes on, how the boys are indoctrinated one way, how girls behavior around each other. And it's Glennon Doyle talks about that in Untamed as well, but obviously from slightly different perspectives, because one's American, one's UK. It's different, but it's a really, really good book.
I ask everybody who's on this show 2 questions.
Okay.
The first question has evolved over the years, and hopefully you'll understand why it's become so convoluted, this first question. But if you met somebody on the street and you had to give them one of these books, what would be the little flowchart in your mind, and what sort of questions would you ask to work out which of these books to give them? Because I know it can vary on the person you're talking to, which book you would recommend.
Gosh, because that would depend on who it was on the street, whether they were male, female, whether they were homeless or not. I would most likely give them one of the non-fiction books. What would I ask them? I probably would be looking towards Untamed or Bimbo. And that, because I think both of those feel quite educational. And I think that whether it was a man or a woman, there's enough in there for both sides to be able to read and enjoy it and get something out of it. So I don't know what I'd particularly be asking them in order to decide and just be pushing on them. This book's really good. But I guess I would be the kind of like reading the room as to whether I handed them the Glennon Doyle or the Ashley James book.
I guess if they were a small business owner who was looking for online advice, that would be Content Fortress.
Content Fortress, straight away. If it was small business owner or someone who was looking to get a blog started, or they were a hobbyist with, they made silver jewellery, let's say, or something, Content Fortress would just cover all of those sides of things. Yes, so that would be one I often do send out to people.
Okay. My other question is, and I honestly don't know the answer to this, but have you ever thought about writing a book? And what kind of book would you write if you were going to write a book? Or have you already written a book and I just don't know about it?
So no, I did. My dad was an avid author. None of them published.
They
weren't very good. But he did self-publish a book a few years ago. But I always grew up with, Dad always had like a word processor, like an Amstrad word processor back in the 80s. And I'd sit there and write short stories on that. And I think in my 20s, I got probably a third of the way into writing a book. And which was very much a novel around kind of 3 women at different stages in life, and then life just moved on and I didn't. I have spoken to, I was talking about it through my podcast producer about actually writing a how to be a web designer book. Obviously I've got my podcast, which is all about how to run your web design business, and I've got a whole community with that. So I think now, yes, I do think about writing a book, not this year, possibly next year. And it would be around running a successful web design business, scaling up, believing in yourself. And I'd love to be able to write it with a storytelling aspect in it as well, where kind of each chapter you have this story of where I screwed up with this or how that or whatever. So that is something that's kind of ticking away in the back of my mind.
Okay. And this comes on neatly kind of segueing onto the most obvious question. Talk about yourself. Where can people find out about you? Where can people who think, oh, I need a web developer, maybe I'll look at Holly's website. Where can they find all that stuff? And where can they... And you've also got a podcast, as you just mentioned. So talk about that.
So the very best place they can find me is on LinkedIn. And I'm at Holly C. Christie on LinkedIn because Holly Christie was taken. Oh. So Holly C. Christie, find me there. I'm very friendly to new connections and I'm very active on LinkedIn. My website for people who are looking for websites is thisdemandinglife.com. Yeah. That came off the back of a blog. It was originally a written thing. Now I've got my work blogs on it. And if you work in the website space and you're looking for support with that as a website designer, a developer, copywriter, websitesmadesimple.co.uk. And the podcast is called Websites Made Simple. You can find it on all the podcasts apps. And it also, thanks to Neil, has its own YouTube channel as well. So, and I think that's Websites Made Simple podcast.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for being the guest on the show. And thanks for the people who...
Been so fun.
People who watched on Amazon, and thanks to people who are going to watch on YouTube in the future and listen to the podcast version of this, which is on Spotify somewhere. I don't know if anybody listens to the podcast version of it, but you never know. So
nice.
Thanks so much for being on the show.